sweet dreams are made of this.
There was one time I was staying at a hotel in Madrid, not too far from the airport, and by the time my buddy and I arrived there, it was 11 p.m. I had completely messed up the booking information because I forgot we were losing a day by traveling from California. My buddy and I arrived at the hotel late and tired. Still, we were given our room number, a card, and sent to our room. I noticed that the more turns we made down the hallway, the less lights worked. By the time we reached our room door, it was dark and scary. I didn't want to say anything implying I was feeling uneasy about the room because I was 24 at the time. I had to be tough. And my buddy was 27. Once we opened the door, the room was bright and looked very modern. I felt a whole lot better entering the room. The room was supposed to have 2 full-size beds, but for some reason, they were pushed together to make a giant bed. My buddy and I agreed that it wasn't a big deal, just to stay on our sides of the bed and deal with it tomorrow when we weren't so tired. I slept on the left and he slept on the right. Sometime between 1 a.m. to 4 a.m., when it was very dark in the room, I woke up and saw a man standing in the corner of our room. I knew for sure this man wasn't my friend. My buddy Cody is about 6'2" and 195 pounds. The man standing in the corner looked about 5'10" and 180 pounds. This was the first and only time I ever experienced sleep paralysis. I remember staring at the guy, who appeared to have his back to me, facing the corner of the room closest to me, as if he was counting for a game of hide and seek. I stared at my arm, hanging off the bed to the left, and focused all of my energy and strength to move it, but I could not move. I tried to scream for Cody to wake up, so at least he could know of the man in the room, but nothing came out. I've never panicked so hard in my life, and before I knew it, my eyes closed and I was unconscious again. It wasn't until 7:30 a.m. I woke up and screamed, "Cody!" and hit him. It was as if everything I tried to do during the night suddenly came out at once. He woke up, startled of course, as I came to the realization that everything was okay. The order of everything I'm about to say next is how I knew there was a ghost in that room. I told Cody, "Dude, I just freaked out. It's just that last night..." And before I was able to finish my sentence, Cody said, "Did you see the guy in the corner?" My jaw dropped as he told me he experienced the exact same thing as me the night before. He had sleep paralysis and couldn't move as he stared at the guy in the corner. We had all of our belongings still, and nothing was changed about the room. It still freaks me out till this day how we could never explain what happened that night, or how we were both able to experience the same thing. Cody ended up experiencing another ghost in a hostel we stayed at, but as for me, that was the only ghost experience I had while traveling.
My story takes place in 2018. Picture it, New Orleans during Halloween or Crew Debut season. My parents and I were there to celebrate my father's birthday. I was also attending a healthcare conference to present research. We had decided to stay at the Hotel Monteleone, located in the French Quarter, because that's where my conference was taking place. Little did I know, it's also known for being haunted. As a psychic medium, I was fully prepared to have many paranormal experiences, but I was not prepared for what happened to both of my parents soon after we arrived. On the first night of our arrival, my parents had to stay in my room because their room was double booked. That night, I woke up around 2 a.m. to find my father sitting up in his bed across from mine. There was a thin, androgynous, 8-foot-tall being, touching his leg. I watched for a few minutes. My dad laid back down, and the benevolent being disappeared. The next day I asked my dad about it, and he said he was visited by an alien being who told him he was healing his sciatica pain. Indeed, his pain disappeared for months and months. 4 days later, my parents are now staying in their room. On the last morning of our stay, my father rings me to please come to their room. I get there and I see that they're both anxious and bewildered. My father then proceeds to tell me that he knows my mother was possessed by a spirit the night before, who kept insisting that she jump from the window in her room. My dad stated that around 3 a.m. the night before, my mother woke him up to tell him to hold her hand and to not let her go. My father thought my mother was having a stroke because her face looked faded somehow. She was there, but not, he said. His intuition told him to keep guard. My mother recounted that she felt when a young woman had entered her body, but she pushed past her to ask my father to hold her hands until morning came. She said the woman kept asking her to go to the window and jump. My mother said all she could do was pray for protection. She said she focused on my dad and asked the spirit to leave her. We left New Orleans a little shaken, but okay. When we got back home, I reached out to the hotel and spoke to the manager about the incident. He informed me that he'd worked there for 5 years, and I was the third person he spoke to who had this experience. He validated that there was a story that a young woman had jumped to her death from that room after being jilted by a lover. I sure do wish they had disclosed that information prior to me booking that room. Now I know better. I ask before I book.
In May of 2021, I booked a room in the New Orleans Hotel in Eureka Springs. I hadn't really picked up any strange vibes when staying there prior. However, there were a few different instances this time around. The very first night I had fallen asleep, I was awoken by what felt like a human finger poking my toes. I was sleeping alone. The second night, I had fallen asleep and again felt a human finger poking my nose. The third night, I was playing my Nintendo Switch and felt fingers or fingernails running through my hair as it stood straight up as if someone had rubbed a balloon on my head. Whatever it was, it definitely felt feminine. My mother, who was sleeping on the bed as I slept on the couch, had said she felt someone sitting at the end of the bed. However, I was asleep during this time. My mother had sat on the balcony, which overlooked part of downtown Eureka Springs one morning, and noticed the doorknob jiggling, as if someone was twisting it on the other end. Yet no one was present. I couldn't really find any stories regarding the hotel being haunted, save for a story regarding a man that was crushed by the elevator. Yet this energy felt feminine. I read a similar story from a guest that complained of the same in the room across the hall, that they felt someone sit on the bed early in the morning.
During the summer of 2009, shortly after graduating high school, my father and I traveled to Estes Park, Colorado. I'd always been fascinated by the paranormal and convinced him to book a room at the infamous Stanley Hotel. Upon arrival, something certainly felt odd about the building. Not necessarily negative, yet a strange tension filled the air. The hotel offers its own ghost tours, where guides recount various reports of encounters with the hotel's many spirits. Jim Carrey had apparently left the hotel in a flustered panic while filming Dumber and Dumber in 1994. Stephen King had, of course, wandered the halls alone in the late 70s, during the hotel's off-season, which would inspire him to write The Shining. Either that very night or the following night, my father and I decided to perform our own séance of sorts. Nothing could help me anticipate the events that followed. We had first asked, "If there's any spirits in the room, could you please respond by knocking?" This was followed by a knock on the wall. Shortly thereafter, we asked for the spirit to reveal itself, which was followed by a full-bodied apparition emerging in the corner of the room, which appeared to be a male, possibly bearded. I ran out of the room, yet didn't feel threatened. More so, my mind was trying to process what I'd just witnessed. Years later, my grandmother captured what appears to be F.O. Stanley in the main stairwell near his portrait. I highly encourage enthusiasts and skeptics to either visit the Stanley Hotel or the town of Eureka Springs, Arkansas, the downtown area, if they want a chance to experience something beyond the general realm of normality.
The Crescent Hotel in Eureka Springs is yet another hotel I've had odd experiences in, although not as intense as the previous two stories, yet in some ways they were. I had stayed there in 2016 and took the ghost tour. The hotel was at one point a hospital ran by a quack named Norman Baker, who claimed he had the cure for cancer, local spring water mixed with watermelon seeds and other ingredients, which was injected into patients. People inflicted with cancer rushed to the hospital, while Norman Baker would write letters on their behalf, asking the family for more money, stating their condition had improved. There was an area in the basement that was once used as the morgue. Prior to COVID, guests were locked in the basement. Upon panning around with my phone camera, I noticed what seemed like 40 to 50 orbs in this room, yet only got one or two in photos. During a tour of the Basin Park Hotel, we downloaded an app which was supposed to be a spirit box. I had written the app off as a hoax after seeing nothing but nonsense come through on the screen. Upon arriving home, I asked the spirit box if any victims of the Crescent were present. The meter immediately began to pick up and continued to beep at a rapid rate, answering my question, "Were you abused at the Crescent Hotel by Dr. Baker?" To which the box replied, "Always." And I told them what an injustice it was that such horrid events occurred with such little consequence to the Dr. Baker, and that I was sorry this happened. My room grew to be very cold. This was mid-spring, and it was at least 75 degrees outside. Then the box said, "Scared," followed with, "Going home." My room returned to normal temperature, and the spirit box began to operate normally.
The following happened when I was on a school French history trip to France and Belgium back in 2014, which incidentally was the 100th anniversary of the start of World War I. However, the paranormal events which occurred in this short trip had nothing to do with the many mass grave sites and historical locations we visited. In fact, they all occurred in the first basic and cheap hotel that we stayed in for the first 2 nights. The hotel, which I've since forgotten the name of, was bordering on a hostel. It was 6 of us to a room, 3 bunk beds, and I was sharing with one of my closest friends. I also knew the other boys fairly well. I remember that on the first day we had been awake for well over 24 hours, so upon arriving at the hotel, we didn't pay much attention to how it looked. However, we found it surprisingly hard to get to sleep immediately. The first strange occurrence happened while everyone was casually chatting as we lay in bed, probably around 11 at night. Each bottom bunk had a light underneath it, and they were all controlled with one central wall switch by the door. I should mention that we had all of these lights off as we were meant to be asleep. However, in the middle of our conversation, one of the lights suddenly turns on. It stopped our conversation dead, and we were all silently confused. This happened several more times, with lights going on and off under the bunks, while the wall switch didn't move. Everyone was getting visibly spooked at this point. However, one of the boys had found a second switch beside his bed, and we soon realized that every bunk had these controls for these lights. With everyone relaxed again, our 14-year-old imaginations calmed down significantly, and everyone began to nod off, one by one. Later in the night, at what I estimate was about 1 a.m, I was still half awake. I've always been a very light sleeper. I was listening to the deep breathing of everyone in the room when I heard an audible click. I turned around and saw that the light to the walk-in shower was on. I assumed that someone had walked in to play a prank. But after quickly scanning my eyes about the room, I could see that everyone was in bed. I was confused, but not frightened. Yet. Shortly after, the shower turned on seemingly by itself, and I again turned over to face the walk-in shower. Sure enough, through the crack in the door, I could see the shower water running. I turned away quickly and lay there for hours, unnerved, before falling asleep. The next morning was busy, visiting several historical sites, and it wasn't until lunchtime in the cafe that a few of us brought up the night before. Several others testified to being awake when the light and shower turned on. We were all slightly unnerved, but it wasn't until the next night that things really kicked off. On the second night, everyone fell asleep very quickly, but as per usual, I could not sleep. I lay awake slightly nervous, and the main light of the room went on and off at intervals of around 10 minutes for around an hour. Then, at around 2 a.m, I heard a huge crash, and I looked around to see that the shower door had swung open completely, hitting the wall. The light was on, and the shower was running. I was terrified. I turned to face the wall and didn't open my eyes until the next morning. The next day, we moved to a different hotel, and the subject of the hotel being haunted was only brought up once more during the trip. Although this is one of the smaller experiences I've had regarding the paranormal, it sticks with me due to how unexpected it was. We found out that the original owner of the hotel had died from cancer, but I saw no evidence or reason that whatever caused the disturbance was her ghost or spirit. It is an experience that will always stick with me as being strange and spooky.
I work at a Hampton Inn and Suites, and I've always had paranormal experiences throughout my life, but I recently started working 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. doing audit at the hotel. I'm by myself and things seem to be more active on this shift. I've spoken to other employees and they've noticed weird things happening, and a few have even seen figures. They've told me about elevators opening and closing without anyone in them, things falling over from across the room, movement sensor lights going off in locked rooms that no one has access to, things like that. Innocent things, and I didn't think much of it. I noticed things like that on my 2 p.m. to 10 p.m. shift when I first started working, but kind of brushed it off. I was the only one on the shift, but there was a constant flow of people in and out of the lobby, so I was around people a lot. My first night working 10 to 6 was with someone, so he could train me. The radios got staticky and loud at around 2:30 to 3 a.m. He said we just have to turn them off because they do that sometimes. So the next day I came in and made sure to turn off all the radios when I got there, so I wouldn't have to hear it. 2:30 to 3 a.m. rolled around and the radios started making their sound again. You can understand my confusion and fear. I made sure they were all off. The motion light in the PBX room turned on. It's pretty much a big room full of computers, and it controls all of the Wi-Fi and systems the computers run on. I'm the only one on shift and no one else is allowed in the back. I walk back there. No one. I shrug it off and head to the kitchen. It's about 3:30 at this point, and again, the motion light turns on in the pantry. The door was closed, but I could see the light turn on from the crack underneath the door. Things like this happen a lot now, but it freaks me out the most when I'll be walking around and feel someone tug on my ponytail or lanyard. Again, I'm the only one on shift and no one else is around. I'll be walking so there's nowhere for it to snag on. We also have plexiglass dividers to separate us from the guests, and I can see my reflection in them. I tend to see movement behind me in the glass sometimes. A wall is behind me, so no one is walking behind me without me noticing. It freaks me out, but I don't think it's out to hurt me. I don't know what entity is at this hotel, but it seems to be much more playful than the others I've encountered. Tonight, I heard something fall over when I was walking in the back office. The top to a large hand sanitizer bottle was taken off and laying on the floor, with the bottle laying spilled on the counter. This is just a short list of things that happen on my shifts. I'm getting used to it, but it still freaks me out. This story I'm about to tell is about a hotel in Kuala Lumpur. It's pretty famous, and if you know hotels well enough, it's one of the more popular ones, which comes with a kitchen and a huge bathroom in the Golden Triangle, with a pretty huge forest reserve right next to it. After finishing my work at about 1 a.m., I decided to call it a night. I turned off my laptop, made sure my iPad was in sleep mode, and crawled into bed. At about 3 a.m., I woke up to my phone lighting up, like I was getting a phone call or alarm ringing. I took it, but there was nothing. Feeling it was just an isolated incident, I placed the phone down next to my bed. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed the screen on the iPad begin to power on and off a few times, not just once. This was strange, as it was always off. At this point, I sat up at the corner of the bed, but directly ahead of me, I notice the TV is doing the same thing. The lights are coming on and off in no specific order. At this point, I'm a bit freaked out, so I turned on all the lights with the master switch, and everything is back to normal. After about 5 minutes or so, I got back under my blankets and turned the lights off. My windows are facing the forest, and I could see the shadows of the trees right in front of me. The curtains were slightly open, and I got the strange but very real sensation that I was being watched. It was seriously overwhelming. I sunk lower into my bed. What happened next, I have no explanation for, but it was terrifying. I began to hear knocking and thumping noises on the window, and then screeching noises began to appear. Imagine someone dragging their fingernails down a wall. That's what it sounded like. Knowing I'm staying at a decently high level, with no balcony and no tree branches within 20 feet of the windows, this was not a natural sound, and I was praying like mad, begging for the sound to go away. I don't know how I managed to fall asleep that night, but I did. I experienced one pretty spooky incident once. My work requires me to travel a lot to most countries in Asia. Most of the hotels I stayed in are the usual 4-star business hotels. from the newer boutique types, while others range from older and aging hotels from the 80s to rundown digs in rural provinces. When I travelled to Jakarta, I would stay in this old business hotel outside the city. I've stayed here several times and had no issues. No late-night knock on the door as warned by my host there. But during my last trip, I was pretty spooked. This is one of those hotels with the old-fashioned elaborate console that controls the lights, has a radio, etc. So the first few nights I switched off the bedside lamp using the console. One night, after an hour or so, the light suddenly came on. I switched it off and went back to sleep. Then, it came on again. It happened a third time, and by now I was spooked. In the end, I unscrewed the bulb. On the last day, on the way to the airport, my host there pointed out an abandoned building downtown and said that it was so because it was haunted by a Pontiac. Apparently, a security guard saw it in the toilet and went insane. Naturally, I was reminded of my episode with the lamp. It was later that I found out that Indonesia has some of the most haunted buildings in the world. So, in the house I grew up in, my bedroom was above the living room area. Quite often we would hear what sounded like someone running across my bedroom. We would hear it numerous times a day, and my parents would sometimes hear it when I was upstairs in the room. However, I never heard it when I was in the room. We heard this running/banging for the whole time we lived there. When I got older and started to think more about it, I discussed it with my mum, and she said that her and my dad had always found it weird. In the last year we lived in the house, we heard it more frequently. So, one day my mum went to our neighbour's house to see if maybe it was coming from there. However, it was deemed impossible, and our neighbours said that they heard it too, and thought I was banging on the wall between my bedroom and their house, which obviously I wasn't. The only weird thing I actually saw when living there was a shadow. There was a streetlight outside my bedroom window, and sometimes I would sleep with the blinds open. I woke up in the middle of the night and saw a shadow of a person just go across the wall. It's almost impossible for the shadow of someone from the street to show in my room, since I was on the second floor. I've never been able to explain it. In the last week of us owning the house, I stayed there alone whilst my parents went and stayed at our new house. We were moving further away, and I stayed there to hang out with my friends, since it was summertime. In that last week, our house alarm set off every single night at different times, which was very weird. So then I moved to our new house. I was 17 at the time, and on the second day, I went to take a shower. When I got into the shower, I felt a solid hand on my back, and it pushed me forward. I was completely startled. I got right out and went into the dining room where my mum was, and I told her about it. She started laughing and said she had experienced the same thing the night before. We both described the feeling exactly the same. I walk to work and have two routes. One has light with no stops like stores or gas stations, and one has gas stations and stores but has a huge dark patch and gets very spooky, and also has a lot of occurrences like the one I experienced today. I took the dark way because I stopped and grabbed a drink, and it was about 4 a.m. I was a bit into the dark patch when, from my left, a wooded area near a field that's attached distantly to my work, I heard what I thought was dog tags. I didn't look, I kept walking, as I knew weird occurrences happen on this road, and I didn't want to spook myself in the dark. It started following me, about 5 feet behind me on the road, but there were no footsteps, only the sound of jingling dog tags. When I would speed up or slow down, so would the thing. The only way to tell was the sound of the dog tags. It followed me until the light of my work started to shine on me, and at that point, it crossed the road and went into the woods. The entire time I had this eerie, off-putting feeling of dread, and this weird smell was surrounding me. But I can't begin to describe it. I felt like if I didn't hurry up and get to work, I wouldn't make it home at the end of the day. That thing was going to do something to me. I just know it.
So my mom would always encounter something paranormal wherever she would be. Her grandmother's house, her house as a kid, her home now. Something would always happen. It could be a full body apparition, or in some cases, half body apparitions. Literally. It could be footsteps, objects moving, etc. I've experienced things too. All of her rooms are upstairs, and we would hear footsteps leave my brother's room and walk into the doorway of mine. Or my mom would hear something like a big dresser falling over, and a bunch of stuff scattering everywhere in my brother's room, or a little bouncy ball bouncing around, and then she would go to see what happened, and the room would be normal, as if nothing happened. My mom visited a medium, and the medium told her that she had a follower. It wasn't particularly evil, or fully good, but mischievous. It liked to mess around, but then she asked if there was a woman and a little boy in the house too. We would occasionally hear a woman's cry for her baby, and a baby cry or something. The medium told her that the follower basically liked to shapeshift, in our case, from a woman to a baby. It would also like to show itself by peeking around our fridge into our living room, or walk in our backyard with half a body. We have what we like to call a Harry Potter closet under our staircase that is used for storage, and my mom's boyfriend and his boss were over talking about all the crazy stuff that would happen around the house, and that very second, something starts to bang real loudly in the closet that they were standing next to. They opened it, and no one was there. My mom and I think that the ghost didn't like him at all, which was funny because ever since they broke up, paranormal activity wasn't all too common as it was before. One night, my little brother and I shared the same room. My mom woke up to screaming, and my little brother was crying with a pile of hangers on him, and no one else could have done it. Everyone in the house was sleeping, but she knew that the spirit did it, and she was mad. She talked to another medium that told her that the experience made the spirit feel bad, that it was just playing around and realized it crossed the line when it messed with her kid. Anyway, hope you all enjoyed.
So this happened years ago, while I was still in high school. I'm now 23 and have never shared this story anywhere, and only ever with a select few people in person. I live in Missouri, just north of Kansas City. One night, my buddy and I snuck out of my parents' house to go smoke. There was a trail that was right by my house and the local elementary school. Never really seen anything out there outside of deer, foxes, coyotes, etc. But growing up, we heard from parents and other families that the woods nearby were haunted, and I never gave it much thought. The area we lived in was right near an old slave farm. After we snuck out, we made it to the trail. On one side of it, there was the backs of houses. To the other side, woods. As we were walking down the trail, it felt like any other time we had done it. For the first 3/4 of the trail, everything was fine. But as we came to the final bend, my friend slapped my arm and pointed into the woods, and asked if I had just saw that. I looked into the woods and saw nothing, so I blew it off, and thought he was just out of it. So I kept walking like everything was fine, while he still had his eyes glued to the woods. At the final stretch, about 50 yards, all canopied over, he slapped my arm again and stopped me, this time with force, so I looked over thinking it was still nothing. I saw a figure of something similar to a human shape but standing about 8 foot high. The reason I saw it was since the trees by it were shaking. At this point, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me, but I was scared nonetheless. I said we should keep moving, and we did. But now, I too had my eyes glued on whatever it was in the woods. We picked up our pace to a speed walk, and after about 10 steps or so, the thing started to move as well, but on a path that would put it on the trail in front of us before the end. At that point, we looked at each other and immediately started running, like running as fast as we could. We made it to the end of the trail and cut through someone's yard into the street. Once there, I looked back towards the trail and saw that figure standing on the edge of the trail. After that, we went back to mine and talked about what just happened. As a couple of notes, there hasn't been any bear sightings up in my area, but we have had some bobcats and cougars. Not sure what it was. I don't think it was Bigfoot, but if it was human, then it had to be some 8-foot tall guy in the woods behind my neighborhood at 2 a.m. So I've been back and forth on whether or not to tell this story, mostly because it involves some aspects of my working life that I am not at liberty to discuss, but also because it had severe personal implications for me. Anyway, I've decided to share it here, and I hope you understand why there are things I simply can't go into detail about. This all started in December 2020. As part of my education, I was scheduled for a 6-month internship at a psychiatric hospital. I had previous experience with working with this type of patients, so I was really excited about it. I switched around the 4 different wards in the hospital, so I treated a lot of different people with lots of different problems. I was curious about all the different aspects, so I never said no to a task, which meant I came across everything from murderers and pedophiles to suicidal teenagers with personality disorders. In my work life, I've had people spit at me, verbally and physically assault me, throw shit at me, and all that stuff. So I like to think I'm a pretty tough guy. And besides that, I always carried a personal assault alarm. One press of a button and staff from every ward would be there in a matter of seconds. On one of the wards, I quickly noticed that there was a certain room which was monitored 24/7 by a guard. To be clear, this is a pretty normal procedure, either because the patient is physically abusive, suicidal, or restrained. But most patients get the watch pulled off them relatively quickly. I asked a colleague and she told me it was a female patient, let's just call her Anne, who was extremely aggressive and psychotic beyond belief. At that point, Anne had been restrained to her bed for 3 months. I could not believe what I was hearing. We have really strict procedures when it comes to restraining people with belts. By the way, they are soft belts made of fabric, not leather. So restraining the patient really is the absolutely last resort we go to. I asked the chief psychiatrist what was up with this girl, and he just scoffed and said, if I only knew, but honestly, she defies logic. He told me that, at first, they thought she was just psychotic, but her symptoms only got worse, no matter how much different medication they tried. Then, they thought she might have suffered a trauma and was in a dissociative state. But that still didn't fit the profile of her symptoms. She had gone from being a perfectly normal woman in her 20s to being violent, extremely aggressive, and unable to speak in just 4 months. That is practically unheard of, especially as no drugs were involved. We regularly make a toxicology check of all patients, and always when they're admitted. One day my alarm went off. They're all connected, so I know where to run to help my colleagues. I immediately knew it had to be Anne, and I was right. She had only her legs and torso fixated. Again, normal procedure, if the patient otherwise is relatively calm. She had defecated in her hand and thrown it at the guard watching her. She then proceeded to bite her fingers so hard that 3 or 4 had really bad fractures. Both her hands were a bloody mess, and she needed like 50 stitches afterwards. It wasn't the blood or the fact that she would throw her own filth at us. I had seen that loads of times. But the screams this woman made, it was the most primal, guttural, and terrifying sounds I've ever heard. It scared me shitless. The best way I can describe it is something like a bear growling and a mountain lion hissing and spitting at the same time. I've seen my fair share of people in primal distress, but I could have never imagined that a person could make sounds like that. As an intern, I'm in no way allowed to use force, so I was just watching as 7 of my colleagues tried to fixate her fully to her bed. They had serious trouble pinning her down. Let me remind you, these are really experienced people. At last, we called a medicinal alarm, which immediately calls for a chief psychiatrist to make decisions. He decided to forcefully medicate her. They gave her 1, and then a 2nd shot. It only seemed to piss her off, even though it should have put a bear to sleep. At the 3rd injection, she calmed enough so that they could restrain her. She never nodded off, she just breathed heavily and kept staring at the same corner of the room, sometimes smoking at something only she could see. Fast forward 2 weeks. I was back at the ward. It was a relatively calm weekend, so there really wasn't much to do. Anne was in one of her good periods, so she had had her restraints removed. A guard was always by her though. I was sitting in the office when suddenly I see Anne walking in the hallway without the guard. I don't know if he had taken a bathroom break or whatever, but he wasn't around. So I catched up with her. I asked her what she was doing in the hallway alone, but of course she didn't respond. I should mention that many of my colleagues were afraid of Anne, and rightfully so. Even though everyone is aware that it's the illness and not the person attacking you, but when it keeps happening, that patient does catch some stigma. I, for one, always tried to look at the person and not the illness, so I asked her where we were going. She took me by the arm and led me to the common area. She went over to a book cabinet, turned and looked at me, and muttered, "Read book." I was completely taken aback by the fact that she was speaking. She pulled out a random book and handed it to me. She then sat down on the floor and started rocking back and forth. I joined her on the floor and started reading the book. It was just some random old book, probably from a charity, and it had no special meaning. But as I read, she came closer and closer to me. Then she cuddled up to me, put her head on my lap and fell asleep. One of my colleagues came by and looked absolutely shocked. And before I knew it, 5 or 6 people, including the chief psychiatrist, were looking at me reading this random book out to her. I caught a lot of praise for this, which is always nice. But then, things took a turn for the worse, for me at least. It started one night when I was home alone. It was a completely normal night for me, until I heard something from upstairs, coming down the stairs. The best way to describe it is like a big dog thrashing and tumbling down the stairs. You know, like when a dog rushes down the stairs to greet you. But this was bigger, much bigger. I could hear the weight of something tumbling down, while nails or claws or whatever slid on the steps. I got up, thinking that somehow there was a massive animal in my house, but there was nothing there. That scared the ever-living shit out of me. I had never had anything like that happen to me. I left the house and stayed the night with my parents. But I also had strange effects on my body, like I had a filter over my eyes or something. Everything started to seem out of focus, like tunnel vision, but with a massive blur added to it. And then I started to disassociate. I had this feeling of being totally out of contact with my body. Then came the panic attacks. My girlfriend called an ambulance one of the times because I was on the verge of a heart attack. The paramedics said I had a heart rate of 240 BPM. I have had no prior problems with my psyche, but I figured it was stress. I have suffered from sleep paralysis before, but never with hallucinations or whatever you want to call it. But that started recently. I see a large black mass with long arms and legs sit in the top corner of our bedroom, like a massive spider, but just with 4 legs. This is now happening on a nightly basis. A couple of days later, I told my girlfriend about it because she kept pestering me with the questions about my nightmares. She said, "That's funny. Every time you're just about to go to sleep, you look up in that corner, and you sort of smirk. That reminded me of Anne. And now, I'm absolutely terrified that I might have brought something home. Believe it or not, that's up to you. I've never treated a patient like Anne, and none of my colleagues had either. It was scary stuff. And I have never suffered any psychological problems before. Never. But something is going on. I'm sure of it. It feels like it wants to get back at me or something. I don't know. And by the way, Anne is much better today. She is in a rehabilitating home where she thrives. One day she might even be able to have her normal life back.
Many years ago in basic training at Fort Knox, Kentucky, our unit was doing a land navigation course. The course is designed to make sure soldiers learn how to read a map and you're tasked to find locations. Once at the location, there is a code that you need to write down, thus proving that you actually found it, and then you make your way back. There's a day course and a night course, both out in the middle of the woods of Kentucky. We set up at the day course site and completed it without incident. However, our drill sergeants, being masters of efficiency and laziness, decided that instead of moving everyone, including themselves, to the location of the night nav course, that they would just make us walk and navigate there on our own. This added about 2 miles in each direction of the course. They did allow us to start our course early, so we could at least get a starting point before dark. We were paired up in teams of 2, so me and my battle buddy planned out our route. One location was in the middle of nowhere in the woods, and the other one was a far distance away, but along a dirt road. Knowing that if we moved quickly, we would still have enough sunlight to work with if we went to the middle of nowhere location first, as it would be the hardest to find, whereas the one along the road next to a cemetery, we figured would be easy to locate without any light. We found the first location without too much difficulty, but the sun was quickly setting and it was becoming twilight. As we made our way back out to the road to the second location, by this time the cemetery was pitch black as the sun had already set. We also only had one flashlight because, in the infinite wisdom of a basic trained soldier, my battle buddy didn't think to bring his flashlight for this night navigation course. We ended up circling around this Civil War era cemetery before we finally found the location marker. We wrote down the code we needed and began a very long walk to the day navigation site. Luckily, it was a straight shot down roads, so we didn't really need to worry about getting lost or trying to get through thick woods at night. However, only about a mile down the road, I began to get this feeling that something was following us. I looked behind us, but saw nothing. The further we walked, the stronger the feeling got, as if it was slowly getting closer and closer to us. I asked my battle buddy if he felt anything, but he just gave me this confused look and began to get very annoyed as I turned around and pointed the flashlight behind us rather than keeping it ahead of us. The feeling of dread kept getting stronger, and I repeated the Lord's Prayer in my head several times, trying to calm myself down or make this thing go away. As the feeling of dread reached a fever peak, it suddenly dissipated and I didn't feel anything behind us anymore. For a split second I was so relieved until it dawned on me that the reason I couldn't feel it behind us anymore was because it was walking right beside us now. It dawned on me that either this was all in my head or my battle buddy is really not sensitive to the paranormal. As the now 3 of us walked for about another mile till we reached our campsite at the land nav course. Once we reached the camp, the feeling had went away and I just relaxed and managed to catch some Z's. Since I never saw anything, and it was just a feeling, I would chalk it up to just being a paranoid thought in my head. But the very next day I went to talk to a very good friend of mine in our unit about it. Before I could even tell him my story, he began telling me a series of weird things that started happening in the camp that night. I'll never forget when he said, "Yeah, it all started to happen just after you got back."
About 20 years ago, I lived in an apartment. I would hear knocking on the ceiling quite often. I asked the woman across the hall about it, and she replied, "Oh, that's just a spirit. It stopped once you moved in." A bit after the knocking started, odd things would happen around the apartment. Things would be moved, windows closed, lights turned off. Things that you would say that I just forgot that I had done. Well, one night, I looked out my bedroom and saw the light from my computer on in the other room. I went in and the screensaver was off. When I went back to my bedroom, I laid down on the bed facing the other room to see if it happened again. It wasn't long before I felt something touch my backside. It was a forceful touch. From that time on, I would wake up with 4 scratches on each shoulder, at least once a week. I switched bedrooms. The scratches stopped, but every time I was going to see my boyfriend, my keys would come up missing. I would find them in the oddest places, even though I knew that I wouldn't put them in the bathtub, the kitchen cupboards, or my dresser. I brushed it off, like I just misplaced them myself. My boyfriend stayed over one night, and in the morning he asked what I had done to him in the previous evening. He showed me his neck. He had 4 scratches on one side, and 1 on the other. It was as if someone grabbed his neck with one hand and scratched him. That was the last time that he came over, and I soon found out that he was not a good person. I moved out of the apartment and into a home with 2 friends. I took the bungalow bedroom. I could hear someone running in the attic every night. It stopped once I put a cross over the door. Odd things started happening. One night we were going to my aunt's home to get my cousin's Ouija board. I distinctively saw someone in our basement when I was the last one to leave. My roommates also would hear someone walking around my bedroom when I wasn't home. A year later I moved into my current home. My cousin moved in with me for a little bit. She would always say that she could hear someone walking up in my bedroom when nobody was home. Nothing much different than the happenings from my apartment happened. Until I met my husband. That's when the traditional haunting things started. Doors closing, things falling, lights flickering, brand new light fixtures breaking. One night when my husband was away and I was working the night shift, I came home to find my back door wide open and the police pulling up. Someone had used a crowbar to remove a window and rob my home. My neighbor saw them taking things from my home and called the police. Had he not called, I would have walked in on them. Almost exactly 1 year later, someone broke into my home again and brutally murdered my husband. Again, I would have been home, but someone stopped me from going home right then. There has been some small things that occurred between the 2 events, and many more since. A car was speeding down the road and driving erratically. It would have hit my home, but it hit a tree and changed its course. 2 dogs were hit by a speeding car in front of my home. The dog that I currently have was hit by a car. Someone attempted to steal my daughter's car, but the alarm went off well after they were in the car. I had a beautiful Doberman that died of cancer when she was only 2 years old. These are just some of the out-of-ordinary events that have happened in the past 5 years. 1 or 2 of these events would be normal, but all of them to the same home in the 5-year span? I am convinced that whatever was in the apartment followed me. However, I do not think that it is malevolent. I think that it is protecting me like it did with my boyfriend. What I am convinced of is that there is something very evil in my home. I say this because I would hear a very odd sound from outside. My dog would also hear it. One night my camera sent me a notification that it captured the sound. It sent chills up my spine that I told my children not to let any of the dogs out. I did investigate the area the next day, and I could not find any signs of animals. I was told by a medium that it sounds like a demon. The same medium told me that the next time the lights flicker, I should tell it that it's my home and it's not wanted. Shortly after this, my daughter and I were cooking dinner. The lights in the kitchen were flickering for about 20 seconds before going out. I figured they were just burnt out. But I laughed and said, "Can you not? This is my home and you don't pay me rent. So until you start paying, you need to leave my stuff alone." I then walked into the dining room and the lights came right back on. I also have a sleep app that records while I sleep. Many, many times it says that I'm snoring, but it actually sounds like a death rattle. On one occasion I had woken up in the middle of the night and heard it myself. One of the recordings actually has some other sound, and at the very end, that is overlapping the rattle. Another recording had me talking in my sleep saying that something is heavy. Then you can hear what sounds like footsteps walking away. Recently my son moved out of the home. I've put my dog's food, water, crate and toys in the room. The past 2 days my dog refuses to go in there. She used to go in there if he was in there, but now it's to the point that I literally have to take her food out of the room or she will not eat. Back in 2014, when I was a teenager, I was still living in my small hometown in Europe, Bulgaria. Me and my childhood friends, 2 boys and 1 girl, were occasionally taking walks along a highway, which wasn't used that frequently. Most of the time we would see a few trucks pass by, but it wasn't full of traffic, and it was very close to where we lived. So it was just a thing we often did. On the left side of it, there were houses, and on the right, there was a huge empty field with some hills here and there, but most of the land was empty and full of grass. On the right side, where the field was, there was an old abandoned canal, which wasn't used since the early 90s. It was full of trash, sticks, and it was also used to dispose of bones of farm animals such as goats and sheep. But there weren't so many. Creepy, yeah, but we knew they were from animals. We've been there before during the daytime. Nothing impressive really, just an empty hole. One ordinary night, we decided to go on another walk along this highway, and we went to the end of it once, then came back. So we got bored since we're always doing the same thing. Someone had the idea to go along the small dirt road which is alongside the abandoned canal, and we didn't give it much thought. Now, bear in mind that on the highway there are streetlights, but on the small dirt road alongside this canal there is no light coming from anywhere. It was a full moon as far as I remember, since it wasn't pitch black, and we could see where we were going without using our phones for light. Anyways, we were walking, joking, laughing and just having some good times really. One of the boys went ahead of us since he was walking faster, whilst me, the other boy and the other girl were behind him, walking a little bit slower. At the middle of the dirt road, the 3 of us decided to go back to the well-lit area on the highway and called the other guy to come back as well. A few minutes passed, and the first boy who was ahead of us was almost at the end of the dirt road when he started running towards us, screaming, "Guys, run!" So instinctively we all turned around to see what was happening, and we just froze. We saw him running very fast towards us, and there was something behind him, following him. Everyone managed to shake out of it and run towards the highway, except me. I stood there for a few more seconds trying to figure out what we were witnessing. It's very hard to describe. It was a figure that was somehow shining bright white light, and it was moving up and down, coming towards us. When I realized I cannot figure out what I was seeing, I turned my back towards it and ran so fast that I even passed the others, even though they started running before me. We didn't stop until we reached the streetlights, and when we did, we turned around. There was nothing behind us anymore. We were terrified at first, but then we just dropped the subject and never spoke of it again. None of us shared this with anybody outside of our childhood group since we thought people would start rumors that we're taking drugs, since it was a very small town. A couple of years go by. We grew up and everyone started moving out to the bigger cities in the area. So at one point I was the only person from our childhood group left in our hometown, since I was the youngest of us 4. This happened in 2017. I was hanging outside in my hometown with some friends, a completely different group of people, who were never close with my childhood friends at any point. We started talking about random stuff. Then it got dark outside and one of the guys suggested that we should share spooky stories. Then he started talking and shared how recently he and 3 other boys were hanging out during the night along the dirt road next to the abandoned canal. At this point, I was all ears. He then proceeded to describe how exactly the same thing happened to them. How they were just hanging out there, and then some weird figure, shining, bright white thing, came towards them. They got scared, ran away, and then when they looked back at the figure, it had disappeared. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My jaw dropped to the ground. Then I shared that a couple of years back, me and 3 other people had experienced the exact same thing, in the very same place, and asked him if any of these people talked with him about this, and if this is some kind of joke. But it wasn't. The story doesn't end exactly here. I went home that night, still stunned, and I barely slept. I kept remembering what happened years ago and trying to figure things out, but thought of nothing that made sense. What we experienced was just unexplainable. So the next day I decided to share everything with my parents and thought that they would brush it off, say that we were just too scared and imagine something. But to my surprise, they were both just staring at me, horrified. I asked them why they were not saying anything and just staring at me. Then they told me how back in the early 90s, when they were teenagers themselves, 2 kids went missing. A 7-year-old girl and a 3-year-old boy. Before they went missing, these kids lived right next door to our apartment, in the house that was facing our balcony. Since it's a small town, everyone thought that the kids would be found soon. But 5 years passed by, and there was no sign of them. Nobody has heard anything. There were no suspects in kidnapping or any leads to what happened to them. Then, on the 5th year of their going missing, the remains were found in the abandoned canal, and by the evidence found there, it was concluded that they had been murdered. The killer was never found. My parents said that this event shook the community back then, and a lot of people avoided going near the canal since this happened. But curious teens were occasionally visiting it and sharing stories of how they have seen something unexplainable. However, nobody ever believed them. To this day, when I visit my hometown and pass the canal, I feel so uneasy and just cannot even think about going alongside the dirt road after knowing what really happened there. Hey guys, weird happening here. About 2 weeks ago I was feeling off, like I was going to have a heart attack or going to pass out or throw up. I don't have insurance at the moment, so I decided I would sleep it off. My daughter's favorite toy was on the couch when I came out to the living room. It is a blue dinosaur plushie she takes everywhere with her. Well, I scooted it over on the couch and started watching TV, hoping I would pass out. I grabbed her toy and had it in my hands to distract me. I eventually fell asleep and woke up the next day. My girlfriend and kid were gone, and I got up to get some water. I looked down on the floor and thought, shit, she forgot her toy, she's gonna have a fit. Then it hit me. Instead of the dark blue toy I see all the time, it was bright green. Now, I'm not crazy. She's had it for a year now, and when I had asked her, what should we name it, I even said we should name it Blue. She throws a fit about the toy constantly and says, I want my blue dinosaur. I want my blue dinosaur. So I know for a fact this thing was blue. I thought maybe she had a second dinosaur similar, and I'm not crazy. Then my girlfriend calls me asking if her toy was still at home. I asked, the blue dinosaur? She replied, no, the green one she has all the time. I said, well, what about the blue one? To which she responded, there is no blue one. What are you talking about? My head started to spin. I started reading online about theories on our consciousness traveling to another dimension when we die, because I admit I was having a bit of death anxiety after that night. I usually have panic attacks or anxiety, but this was way different. Anyways, I started looking into theories about souls and consciousness, and came across that one and how it lays within the parameters of infinite universes and small things in people's lives changing after an accident, near-death experience, etc. I'm not convinced I died, but something weird definitely happened that night, and now I have this bright green dino making me question everything I know. Just for clarification, I have not had COVID recently. I don't have any gas in my home. My water heater is gas, but it's outside in a closed area. And I have a CO2 detector in my apartment, so I think I'm solid regarding that. And I don't take any medications or anything of the sort. Now, I was never the type of guy that believed in parallel universes or multiple dimensions. But after a strange experience and years of research, I have begun to wonder about the possibilities of such things existing. My change in mind occurred after a strange experience 5 years ago. I remember that date clear, 6th of September 2016. It was the day after I had moved into my new house, which I still live in today. It's a fairly old house and I've experienced many odd things, though those are different stories. The home was built 1974 to 1976 and was completed in late September of that year. It's had a few owners, one of which was my father's former boss. It's been kept in very good condition and retains many of its original features. Right, the story goes like this. It was our second day in the house, and our first night in the house I woke up early, around 7 p.m.ish to help unpack boxes and our items. We were also moving items out of the house which belonged to the previous owner. I was loading a box labeled silverware from our old green car, which was a 1995 Honda Odyssey. The box was heavy and I lost some grip on the box. Luckily, I have a quick reflex and quickly reacted and nudged the box back into my hands using my knee to prevent myself from dropping it. It was when I looked up again, things appeared differently. The first thing, which was hard for me not to notice considering the box was right in front of my eyes, was the word silverware. It had completely been replaced with the word records and books in a vivid black. I was confused at first and simply dismissed it as my bad eyesight. It was not until I leant down to place the box down on the lawn temporarily to close the car door that I realized that something was completely different, and it wasn't my eyes playing up. The car, the distinctive green 1995 Odyssey, was gone, and instead was replaced with a red Ford pickup truck. In complete utter shock, I quickly hurried into the house to find my father. I don't know why, and have no clue what I would have told him. When I hurried into the hall, I spotted a figure walking into my parents' bedroom. He was tall and young, maybe 35 to 45 in years, and around 5'8". He wore a brown suit. It almost looked like a tweed suit. He himself hurried down the hall quickly, so I quickly followed this man in confusion. When I walked down the hall, I noticed the carpet was cleaner, and the stain I had noticed earlier near my bedroom was gone. Perhaps if I hadn't been in such a frenzy, I would have noticed other changes. Anyways, I swiftly walked into my father's room. It was right at that moment when everything went back to normal. The man disappeared and boom, I nearly toppled my father as I walked right into him when entering his room in which the man had entered. We were so close I could feel his breath. "Whoa, buddy, slow down," I remember him clearly state. He was clearly as confused as I was. When I told him what I saw, we both walked outside, and there the green Odyssey sat, parked under our willow tree, the box where I left it, and the car door open. My father quickly dismissed the situation. I cannot explain what occurred in those brief moments, and probably will never fully understand what occurred on that warm September day. My father doesn't have an explanation for what happened that day. He recounts that day as well. From his perspective, he remembers clearing some boxes, standing near the sliding doors of his bedroom when he saw the same man walking away from the door. I find it odd that the man was walking in two completely opposite directions. He got curious and followed, in which then I came storming in, falling into my dad's chest. I've told my family multiple times this story. None really believe me. It has sort of become a dinner table story for them. I truly believe I was briefly transported into a different era. I can't confirm it, and perhaps if I had a phone back then, I could have taken a photo or two. I was 15. My parents were the type of parents who disapproved of young teens having phones. Whether it was a time slip, a glitch in the matrix, or my mind playing tricks, this experience will remain in my memories for years. I saw my dead father driving a car. I was 11 at the time he died. When I was a kid, he would tell me that once I got taller, he'd get me to play 8-ball pool with him. This never happened because he died before I was even 5'4". Fast forward to last Saturday night. I was playing 8-ball pool with my friends. At one moment, the memory of him telling me that once I got tall he'd get me to play with him crossed my mind, and I sort of wished we would have got to play. Didn't pay much attention though. On our way back to our homes, being on foot, we were walking on the road but made room for cars to pass whenever they approached us. Once we were about 3 blocks away from my house, I saw a car passing, with my father as the driver. I'm so sure it was him. I've seen his dead body, so he can't be alive. And even if he was, why would he be driving in our neighborhood? I almost screamed and wanted to start running so as to catch the car, but I figured out it would be pointless. I even thought of throwing my phone at the car so as to catch its attention. I kind of regret it now. I'm not sure. Honestly, it's not like I miss him like hell and think of him 24/7, so I don't think my mind would make this up. Anyone experienced anything similar? I should be dead, but I woke up and things are different. I dreamt I was in a car accident on February 20th, 2022. I was driving down a bendy back road I take when traffic gets bad. No one takes it besides some older locals because it's out of the way and, when the weather's bad, dangerous. This country road follows along a steeper hill, which, at the bottom, is a river. Maybe 25-30 feet at its deepest point. I've fished there off and on since I was a kid. We had a small storm roll in on the 20th. It wasn't forecast, nor had I seen any clouds that suggested the weather shift. It was sudden, and I was on the back road. I was on my way home from work, almost 5 p.m. when the weather finally shifted. I didn't think much of it. I'd driven in worse. A lot worse, actually. But I still slowed down a bit as I rounded the sharper curves in the road. I had my favorite playlist going, one my partner and I made together a few months into our relationship. Her favorite song was playing, Eugene by Arlo Parks. I was in the second to final curve in the road when it happened. A big Ford truck, an F-150, flew around the curve, his headlights on high as he came into my lane. I remember jerking the steering wheel. I remember the force of the truck hitting the front driver's side of my car and sending me spinning. I remember the screech of metal on metal as I slammed into the guardrails. I remember not having control over my shitty old 2008 Mazda Tribute. My car smacked into trees and through vegetation as it tumbled and rolled down the hill before it finally splashed into the river. It took me several seconds to come to realize I was sinking and that water was flooding my car. I tried moving. I knew I needed to get out and fast, but my legs were pinned by the steering wheel. My jeans were torn and I could see the muscle and bone of my thighs. I remember trying to get myself free, pushing against the wheel, grabbing onto the passenger seat and pulling myself, and screaming at the pain it caused. I remember looking through my cracked windshield and seeing the water just beginning to darken as my car sank. The water was rising in my car. It was freezing cold against my skin. I kept trying to get free, to force the steering wheel to move, to pull my legs out from under it. I remember thinking of my partner, of my brothers, my niece, of my father, of the kids I work with. I remember thinking, this is how I'm going to die, without saying goodbye. That's when I looked for my phone. It was in my cup holder before the crash. By the time I found it, it was on the passenger's side floor. I reached for that damn thing for what felt like ages, but couldn't have been longer than a few seconds. By some miracle, the screen lit up when I pressed the power button. I remember the relief that flooded my chest when it did. At this point, the water was moving up past my waist. I called my partner, but it went to voicemail. It made me want to cry, but I spoke anyway. In that moment, I wasn't thinking about the water, or the pain, or the cold. All I could think about was her. I told her I wasn't going to make it to dinner, and that I was sorry. I told her I wished I could make it up to her someday, but that I wasn't sure I'd get a chance to. I told her I loved her more than anything in this world. Something I've always said. I told her I wish I had gotten a chance to show her the Grand Canyon, a trip we had talked about for months. That I wanted to see her, get another chance to hold her. I wanted to say so much more, but the line beeped and the call ended as the water reached my neck. I remember crying to myself, trying to think of something else I could do to get out of this, to survive. But the water kept rising, and in the end, I simply stared up through it at the faint flashing light at the surface, blue and red. I prayed as the air began fighting to escape my lungs, as the pain pulsed through my skull and chest. I prayed until I couldn't anymore. I prayed until my vision went black and I couldn't fight to hold my breath any longer. And then I woke up, alone in bed, freezing with a cold sweat, but awake and confused. I don't know how or why I am here, because I died. I felt my body die. I felt the water enter my lungs and the pain that it caused. I felt it all. From the first impact of the truck, to my legs being pinned, to drowning. I shouldn't be here. This happened several years ago at a TGI Fridays in Killeen, Texas. I was eating with my family when we saw our friend Jesse sitting at the bar across the restaurant. Jesse is easy to spot, with broad shoulders and a distinct widow's peak, and he was even wearing a green striped shirt, such as he often wore. We called out to him, but he didn't hear us. Some guy he was sitting with noticed and told him we were trying to get his attention. So Jesse started walking towards us, and it was only when he came within about 10 feet of us did I realize it really wasn't him. He was almost identical, but not quite. Of course, this poor guy looked very confused to be summoned to a table full of strangers. Embarrassed, I apologized and explained that we had thought he was our friend Jesse. He was understanding, but then explained that his name was Jesse. So it had been extra confusing that we seemed to know him, but he didn't know us. It was some time later that we were eating again at TGI Fridays, when I caught sight of a server and immediately smiled and raised my hand to greet her. I knew her very well, not as a server, but as someone significant enough in my life that I'd actually hung out with. As she seemed to look right through me, I put my hand down and figured I was wrong. But I was so confused because the feeling had been so strong that I knew who she was. It drove me crazy, but there was nothing I could do. She turned out to be our server. She took my dad's order first, and then when she turned to me, her eyes widened and she said, "I know you. How do I know you?" We went through every possible scenario we could think of and never could figure out how our paths had crossed. And I can guarantee you, they just had not. We covered all bases, and even if we had passed each other in a store or something, it would not explain the intense familiarity we both felt. I begin to joke about the mysticism of that particular TGI Fridays. After the double Jesse experience, 2 friends of mine, each in an unrelated event, encountered other doubles and told me about it. I told them we were going to start calling it Doppelganger Fridays. Of course, this all seems like pure coincidence, but it's just interesting that it keeps happening at the same place. I've had a few experiences where I'm convinced I glitched, but this recent one freaked me out. Let's start with, I do no drugs, not weed, nothing. I do not even drink. I have to let you know this because the story makes me feel like I should have been. I have lived in my neighborhood for 43 years. I take the same route to and from every day. As a child, my mother walked us to school on this route. So needless to say, I know every street in the neighborhood. About 3 months ago, I had to go to work, so I went to the Little Caesars, got my pizzas and my daughter, and I headed home. This is where it got unexplainable. I'm heading down, making it about 2 streets, and suddenly, there are buildings on those streets that I've never seen in my life. Then, the one factory-like building, I see these men in weird hats and suspenders, unloading an old truck. But the truck looked very new. Basically a truck from the 20s. I keep driving. Then I notice another factory, and these other men in the same type of clothes are unloading milk bottles. I look at my daughter and say, WTF. I pull over and get on my GPS. My GPS tells me I'm in the exact street I'm supposed to be on. So I put the GPS in the holster and make it a point to look at the streets. The street said the right name, so I was exactly where I knew I was. I get to the main roads and tell her we're going to turn around and head back the way we came. We make a left, and I turn around under the bridge, and as soon as I do that, everything is normal. My street is there, the factories are gone, it's just normal. During these strange happenings, I felt a weird uneasiness in the air. I was literally terrified, like when someone is watching you. My GPS had a lot of static, and my maps even looked weird. I don't know. Like I said, I have had other events, but this one definitely lasted the longest. I often drive that route on purpose now to make sense of what happened to us, but I've yet to get an explanation. The funny thing is, where I live back in the day, there were indeed a lot of factories in the city. I found pages about glitches and stuff like that, and had I not had this one last as long as it did, I would think someone like me was crazy or had some kind of narcotic or was drunk. I don't know. Maybe I will be so lucky again to experience this, because next time I'm stopping and asking what year or place I'm in, and getting a flyer or something as proof that there's a glitch in this place we call life. My partner and I are visiting Oakland, California. It's our first day in town. We're walking around, window shopping and checking out the area when a random man approaches us. Hey, how's your visit gone? We assumed he was a homeless man just being kind, and with us being from the Midwest, it's probably not hard to tell we're not from the area. We respond with a generic, our day's been fine, thanks. And yours? I can't remember the exact words said, but after answering, he stated that he met us yesterday. We laughed and said it wasn't possible. It's our first day in town. You must have confused us with someone else. He responded, No, it was you two. You guys gave me an orange and we chatted for a few minutes. That definitely sounds like something we might do. But seriously, we had only just got into town. It definitely wasn't us. The man then proceeded to tell my partner, You're from Missouri. You're wearing a blue Kansas City shirt. He said a couple of other things, but I was in shock, so I don't remember what he said after that. Anyways, this was accurate information. He had that exact shirt. He wasn't wearing it that day, but it was one that he wore all the time. We still, to this day, have no idea what that was. It makes my head hurt thinking about it. I went for a hike a couple of days ago, and I think I may have shifted, or am, in between two realities since. I think the shift happened in the woods. Swore I saw my sister's dog run over a hill in the distance and not come back, so I'm calling for her. My sister and dad ask me what I am doing. The dog is right in front of us, and always has been. I tell them what I saw and we laugh it off, that I saw what was happening in another reality. But nothing's been the same since. Like, my mum has been extra different to me. I'm visiting for a week. I live in a different state than my hometown. I asked for cupcakes, and she, for the first time ever, got dairy-free ones for me. I've been dairy-free for 8 years. Washed a towel and bedding for me with fragrance-free detergent. I've been using fragrance-free for 8 years, etc. My niece has been extra clingy to me, like crying that I'm leaving, while the last few times I visited, she was just like, okay, bye. So besides anything feeling different since hiking in the woods, I saw a bug in my bathroom on the radiator. I went to pick it up with a random bottle, and I swear to God, the minute the bottle touched the bug disappeared. That's why I'm wondering if I'm stuck or transitioning or something, where I'm seeing parts of one universe while being in another. Is this possible? I know it seems crazy. Is there any way to know? Anything I should worry about? This has happened several times when hiking in a specific general area, about 10,000 acres, in New Hampshire, US. Looking at my watch or noticing the position of the sun in the sky is hours later in the day than it should be. I can't explain the lost time. This area was settled by Abenaki in the old times. There is at least one artifact, bowl carved in a rock ledge near a waterfall, that was recorded by archaeologists. An Indian trail is shown on old maps. I found petroglyphs, and I suspect graves and other things. The area was settled by Europeans for a time, but they all left or died. There are only cellar holes and cemeteries now. It's all gone back to woods. There is a lot of iron in the bedrock. Compasses don't always work right. It seems to me that lightning hits some of the hills much more often than is typical, though I'm not any kind of expert in that field. I am experienced in hiking and camping in the woods. The amount of lightning scars on the trees is crazy in my opinion. I don't drink or use drugs, and I have never had lost time in any other place. This happened back in the 80s. I was between 9 and 10 years old. I was an only child at this point, and my mother was a single mum. She had taken all the money she had and bought a trailer and some land and moved out to the country. I can still remember how she installed the septic system, installed the plumbing and an electrical pole, and how we wired that to the house. This had given me great fascination with electricity. I was always helping her with these projects. I grew up knowing a lot more than most kids about these kinds of things. We lived in a rural area in East Texas, on a 2-acre tract of land. Houses were sparse and situated quite far apart, so not a heavily populated area. I was a lonely kid for the most part living out there. I digress. I'll move on to the day they came. My mum was busy with something in her room, which was situated at the far end of the 72-foot trailer we lived in. I went into the kitchen for something and heard a knock at the door. I went to open it and found 4 kids standing outside, 2 boys and 2 girls. I opened the screen door and the larger of the boys asked,
Can we use your phone? We need to call our mum.
I was immediately suspicious because where had these kids come from? I've lived here a few years and knew all the kids in the neighborhood. I remember looking at the larger boy's eyes and thinking something was different about him, but couldn't put my finger on it. I shrugged and opened the screen wider and let them in. I left the front door open as I took them into the kitchen and pointed to where the phone was. The larger boy picked up the phone as my mum called to me. I ran into my mum's room and she said, "Who was in the house?" I told her a bunch of kids wanted to use the phone. She looked angry and said, "You don't let anyone in the house. Tell them to leave." I walked out of her room and back to the kitchen to tell them they had to go, and found the phone off the hook. The front door was still open and the screen door closed. I ran to the door and outside to look for the kids. They were nowhere to be found. They couldn't have even had time to walk or run across 2 acres to get to the street. So where were they? After that happened, life was super weird. Mum was always getting sick, unable to find sustainable work, and became heavily paranoid and got into damaging relationships with men. Of the most weird occurrences was when she didn't have the ability to pay the phone bill, so the phone company came and disconnected the phone. However, we still kept getting phone calls. I rarely ever answered the phone, so when Mum told me this, I was skeptical and didn't really believe her. Then one day she was busy outside and the phone rang, so I answered it, and I heard a woman say hello on the other end. It sounded like my aunt. Then, it just all went to static. When Mum came back in, I told her what had occurred, so she went to her neighbours and called the phone company and asked them to check the line. Then our phone was ringing. They came out, inspected the line at the pole and came inside and told my mum, "There is no way you're getting phone calls. The line is completely disconnected. It's cut at the pole." This happened constantly, even after my mum moved the trailer to another city. In that city, she had failed to pay the bill again, and again, we kept getting phone calls that ended in dead air or strange voices and static. The linesman told her the same thing. There was no way our phone was ringing, but yet, it did. To this day, I really don't know what to make of any of that. But it was also around this time I began to experience things like words of knowledge and clairaudient experiences where I would know things I'd never learned and hear things before they happened in physical reality. I mostly kept these experiences to myself and would just think, how weird. When Mum sold that trailer, we never had those weird phone experiences again, and the clairaudience also went away. A few other weird occurrences. While still living in the country, I was sitting in my mum's bed next to her. She was saying, "It feels like bugs are crawling all over me." I got off the bed and walked over to her dresser. For some reason, I felt the need to look up. On the ceiling, there were millions of tiny spiders. This is no exaggeration. I knew my mum would freak out, so I told her, "Mum, please get up and leave this room." She looked at me with a look of concern and asked why. I said, "Please, just get out of this room." She then gave me a look like I was being impossible. So I told her, "Look up." I had never seen her leave a room so fast after she looked up and saw that mess. Literal arachnophobia. We fumigated the house directly after that several times a year. It could be unrelated, but I have never seen anything like that before or since. After we had moved the trailer to another city, some lights would either dim or get brighter and brighter when we turned them off, until they literally popped. When Mum called the electric company, they sent an electrician out to inspect. He climbed the pole and, when he went to test one of the lines, it literally popped him off the pole and he flew to the ground. He was okay, though a little shocked, pun intended, and shaken. The electric company's stance on the issue was that there was a miswiring at the pole. It was most likely that they missed the ground. Again, could be unrelated, but the circuit breakers never tripped during these episodes. I had this really strange experience last year, and my brother just told me about BEK. I feel like that's what I saw. So last year during Christmas time, my sister and I were having a hard emotional night, and we decided to go around looking at Christmas lights. I was driving and we were just crying and talking and looking at the decorations. There was a meteor shower that night, and we ended up on this super creepy back road with nothing around. No houses or buildings, no streetlights, just woods. Somehow, we both saw a meteor falling in the sky as I was driving, and we both screamed with shock and excitement. As we looked back down on the road, there was a small child on the side of the road. It had a backpack and was just staring at the car with this insanely scary grimace on its face, with huge, black, sunken-in eyes. It didn't move its body, but its head was moving with the car as we drove past. We freaked the hell out, screaming and crying and just in utter shock of what the hell was that. It filled us with such terror, and we were both so distraught and upset. We couldn't stop shaking and crying, and we couldn't rid ourselves of this horrible feeling. I felt guilty for not stopping if it was someone that needed help. But it was in the middle of winter, late at night. Nothing was around that road, and there was no reason for someone to be there. And they weren't trying to flag us down for help, just staring. We called the cops and went home and couldn't sleep all night. I still have PTSD when I drive at night. I hope to have some insight, comments, advice, or help on what happened about 2 weeks ago. I am a little familiar with the black-eyed children phenomenon, but need some help to identify what exactly happened, to help two family members who might not have been right since the sighting. In 2013, I moved with my family to a foreclosed 6-bedroom home on 14 acres, straight up in the middle of nowhere in the Poconos. My father and I noticed very weird things going on the second we moved in, but my mother and sister seemed to not notice these things. Everyone besides me and my dad in my entire family are the, oh, it was the wind type of people, if you get what I mean. Not going to go into everything that happened there, as it would fall under a different paranormal thread. There is some evidence that the entire area of where this house is located is haunted, as in ghosts and Native American burial grounds and other things. Now, historically speaking, with actual evidence, people settled here around the old mill area long ago, and brutally killed many Iroquois Indians. This area is very spread out over miles of heavily wooded mountains. 2 weeks ago, my uncle on my mother's side and his girlfriend came to visit my parents' home. They do this quite often, as my parents always have people over for beer, games, bonfires, etc. I just want to start off by saying my uncle is a non-believer, a Harley rider who, to this day, I've never seen him really scared of anything or anyone before this sighting. My uncle and his girlfriend are playing foosball with my parents when they realize it's 12:30 a.m, so they decide to head home. They take all back roads, and once they turn onto Running Valley Road, 6 minutes from the house, my uncle's girlfriend sees 2 figures. They were pretty far away at this point, but it was 2 small figures waiting to cross the road. Just to mention, there was nothing out here. No houses beside one abandoned one that was still 2 miles up the road. One thing about the vicinity is a cave. These figures were attempting to cross the road to go into the woods, which was very odd because of the time and location. They are now approaching these figures. Headlights start to shine directly on them. Both my uncle and his girlfriend see 2 young girls, aged approximately 9 to 11 years old, one much bigger than the other, wearing what my uncle best describes as early 1900s church clothing, like dresses to the knee with white cotton shawls or cropped sweaters and flats. Weird, right? What are 2 10-year-olds doing at 12:30 a.m. in the middle of nowhere wearing church clothing? They also noticed the bigger child had her arms wrapped around the smaller one, like you would do if she was hurt, scared, or cold. At this point, my uncle's girlfriend is like, "It's children, we need to stop and help." By now, the truck is almost right next to the little girls. Both had their heads held down, so the bigger of the 2 starts to lift her head up to look at the passing vehicle. Then, both my uncle and his girlfriend notice the girl has no eyes, just black holes, as if they were carved straight out of her face. Girlfriend says, "What the hell was that? You saw that, right? Oh my god, turn around and go back right now." My uncle, scared shitless, takes off, flying to get home. They get home and get into an argument because she wants to drive back to see what was up. She grabs her own car keys and basically my uncle was like, "You're not going back there. We're never going on that road again." He calls my parents in extreme panic and tells them they should start bugging because they know he would never lie or be that freaked out if it wasn't warranted. So my mum starts to tell me everything. Mind you, my family knows nothing of black-eyed kids. Never heard of it before. I send my mum an article to forward to my uncle with some of the very basic info. Young kids, no eyes, dreadful feeling. Sometimes outdated clothing, hitchhiking or at your door looking for help, etc. Now my whole family is bugging. Sorry for this being so long, I wanted to give all the info. Please let me know what y'all think. Or let me know if you experienced something similar to this. I've had 2 encounters with them. The first time was 2 years ago or so, in a gas station parking lot off Highway 58 in Tennessee, at like 3 or 4 in the morning. My friend had parked towards the far end of the lot, around the side of the building. I was sitting in the passenger side of my friend's car waiting for him to come out of the store from buying his cigarettes. I was fairly relaxed, enjoying the radio, and then I hear a knock on the window. I looked over and there was a boy. He looked about 12. He was wearing a grey hoodie with his hood pulled up. I cracked the window and asked him what he wanted, and he responded with,
Can I borrow your phone?
I wasn't going to let some strange kid use my phone, so I told him that I was sure they'd let him use the one inside the store. He insisted on it though, and it was the weirdest thing because the longer he stood there, the more unsettled and scared I started to feel. I had rolled up the window by this point, and he became something less than aggressive but more than insistent. That's when I saw his eyes. His hood slipped back because of his movements, and the only way I can describe the feeling of looking into those eyes is primal fear. That's about the time he quickly moved to the nearby tree line, and a few seconds later my friend got into the car. He said I was pale as a ghost and asked me what was wrong. At the time I had no idea what the hell that was all about and had trouble describing it all to him. He looked at me strangely and said he didn't see the kid at all. That really got to me. So when I got home I couldn't sleep and found out exactly what I had encountered. The second encounter happened shortly after in my house. This was about 3.5 weeks ago. I'm a night owl, so I'm up at pretty ridiculous times of night a lot of the time. And I was up at around 3:30ish in the morning, yet again, and watching YouTube videos. Then, I hear a knock on the front door. I would have normally just avoided a knock on the door at that time of night, but my roommate's girlfriend had left only about 20 minutes prior, so I assumed it was her, having forgotten something. It wouldn't have been the first time. So I went to the door and cracked it a bit to look outside. And there was these 3 kids. One looked to be around a 16-year-old girl. The other 2 were little boys who appeared 6 and 10 respectively. They wouldn't look directly at me and held their heads at a downward angle. The porch light cast a pretty heavy shadow over their features, so what they were was, again, obscured. I hadn't forgotten about my previous encounter, but I didn't know any of the neighborhood yet and couldn't just assume black-eyed kids when it could have been desperation standing at my doorstep. I opened the door a bit more, and before I could ask what they were after, the girl said, "Can we come in to use your phone?" I told her I could fetch it and let her use it, but again she asked to come inside. It was as if I hadn't said anything at all, and her insistence grew just like the last time. She stepped from the front walk to the bottom step of my stoop and looked up at me. I saw those eyes again, slammed the door and went back to the living room, a good distance away from the front door. I heard a few more knocks over the following few minutes, growing more aggressive with each volley until they stopped. I didn't dare get close to the door or windows again until sunrise. I've since installed security cameras around the perimeter of the house. So there you have it. Those were the 2 times I've had encounters with BEK. Has anyone else here had any run-ins with these things? The actual encounter happened about a month ago, maybe 3 weeks. I don't really have a concrete schedule right now, so I'm not really sure. Either way, I was walking home kind of late at night, and it gets dark out pretty early, so I was kind of on edge walking home alone. But it's a pretty safe neighborhood, so I wasn't actually that concerned, and I was only like 15 minutes from home anyway. There's a high school that I walked past on my way home. They haven't been opened recently, obviously, and there's a big gate out front that's been locked since the actual proper lockdown started. I walked past it enough that I don't usually even look at it, but something caught my eye that night, and I looked. Through the locked gate that touches the top of the kind of arch thing it's in, so you can't just climb over it. And there's this couple just standing there, facing the bars, looking straight ahead, holding hands. That startled me enough to look closer because it was weird that anybody would be there, especially at 11 o'clock at night. And their eyes were just blank, dull black. No whites, no iris, just black. And they didn't react to me looking at them. But I also just stared at them, making eye contact the whole time I was walking past. I remember turning my head to keep looking, but not really being aware that I was doing it when it happened. Anyway, I guess I actually processed what was happening and turned away real quick and speed walked home because it freaked me out. Ever since then, I feel like things have just been sort of weird. Not in a way I can really put my finger on, just kind of off. Like they got into my head. Anyway, that's what I got. That's what happened. Not really sure why I'm posting it here, other than I just wanted to talk about it somewhere. I've been raised in Florida my whole life, from Orlando to Miami. This took place in Orlando though, in a neighborhood I lived in. Since the time I was a child, nothing like this had ever happened before in that area paranormally related. A lot of crime though. I'm starting college now, and this happened in 8th grade summer going into 9th grade. I was at my old friend's house who lived in the same neighborhood. It was a very sunny day and we hung out for a bit, and I started making my way back very early afternoon. I think around 2 p.m, not even 5 minutes into my walk, a small boy approached me. He was wearing jeans and a green polo shirt that had a symbol on the corner, like a polo shirt would, so I thought he was from an organization. He handed me a card, but when I looked at him, there it was, the black eyes. They were all black completely. I was taken aback so much, I took 2 steps back. Mind you, there was no one around whatsoever. As soon as I got startled and realized he had black eyes, an elderly black woman appeared on the opposite side of the street staring at me. They both wore the same shirt the boy did and had pure black eyes too. Not that it matters, but I have never heard stories of black-eyed people being black, so I mentioned it for that reason. When I noticed her staring at me, this kid still tried to hand me the card, but he never said anything. Ever. And I don't know why, but I took it. Then, my mum came out of nowhere, like a millisecond after I grabbed the card. She came speeding down the street because she knew I was at my friend's house, and she tells me to get in. I do so because I'm scared, and she asks me if I'm okay. Once I'm in the car, she told me she had an extreme sense of peril and doom come over her out of nowhere at home. And she said she dropped everything and got in the car and sped to where I was at. My mother has been spiritually gifted since she was a child. She's had paranormal things happen. She's also a low-key psychic. She took me back home and I told her what happened, and she said to burn the card away from the house that the boy gave me. She burned it, and that was it really. Just a wild sort of a trip that happens sometimes. What do you guys think? this was all about. I've spent decades in the military intelligence community, so I don't want to put out too much information about myself on a public forum. However, I'm curious if any other experiences overlap my own. We lived off base in this rundown community that looks like any other rundown community you might find anywhere else, next to a military installation. The apartment complex itself was nice by the standards of the rest of the buildings in our area. At 12:30 on a Friday morning, I was woken up by a series of knocks on my heavy wooden door. I have a rule. One series of knocks is just people messing with their neighbors. But if they really need something, they'll knock twice. Yep. There came the second series of knocks. I expected it to be someone from work trying to get a hold of me, and my cell phone had died. It had happened before. I opened the door and stared down at this kid that I estimate to have been about 6 years old. There was so much about the kid that was bizarre. The eyes feature suggested in BEKs seems kind of trivial. I can't say with 100% confidence that his eyes were all black orbs. I just don't know because the rest of him was such a mess. When I look at people, I have a habit of avoiding eye contact. The rest of his description is as follows. Clothing: grey filthy hooded sweatshirt with hood up halfway, with matching sweatpants. Shoes: unremarkable. Skin complexion: for lack of a better phrase, I would say that he was extremely pale. Not clear if there were blemishes in way of freckles on this skin, or if he was just really dirty. Hair: possible reddish brown, messy, dirty, short. His face was in this grimace of hatred. His expression was like someone who was sucking on the world's most sour candies. Here's the worst part of it. The body odor he was radiating was like something I've never smelled before or since. I've smelled decomposing bodies in war. The closest smell I can relate it to was in Ranger School. In Ranger School, due to the lack of food and rest, often guys' bodies would start to consume muscle for energy. Combined with the lack of bathing opportunities, this creates an odor that is hard to top. But this kid smelled like weaponized foulness. I asked, "Can I help you?" In a flat voice, void of inflection, he said, "My parents don't like you." I responded, what?" He stated, "You'll be okay if you give us something great." I slammed the door on him because I thought he was just screwing with me. He let out this "no." I could hear him on the other side throwing a tantrum like you see toddlers in the store when their parents won't let them have something. Definitely a very strange thing to do at midnight. However, kids running around the dilapidated neighborhood unsupervised was a pretty common occurrence. I just chalked it up to bad parenting. I showered and threw my clothes out because I didn't want that stench on me. I went back to bed because I had to be up again in 4 hours. The strange thing is that the stench didn't seem to linger. I saw this kid on 3 other occasions. The second time I was going out to my car in the morning, and he was standing in the parking lot, glaring at me. When I came home, he was staring at me, standing in the same spot. Then, when I looked out the window hours later, he was still in the same spot, glaring with the same sneer at nothing. I asked my wife what she made of him, and she said he wasn't bothering anything, which was a pretty low bar for that neighborhood. Kids would often run around vandalizing people's vehicles and apartments. I thought about calling the authorities. However, what was I going to say? There's this weird kid. He might need help because he's weird. And he stinks. The truth is that I hated this kid. Now, I have 3 kids of my own, so I don't just hate other kids. However, I hated this one. I hated his smell. I hated that he existed. I felt like he was trying to target and bully me for some reason. No, I didn't want to help this kid. Also, I had these paranoid thoughts of, if this kid hates me as much as I hate him, he's going to lie to the cops and tell them that I had harmed him. it could affect my security clearance. It's best just to ignore him and this will all go away. One time I saw him interacting with kids outside, so I know he wasn't a figment of my imagination. However, he didn't play with them like a normal kid. This girl would come up and grab him by the arm, and he would just stand there and glare at her. There were kids running around him and he just stared at them with that grimace. My wife wanted me to share this experience that I had back in 2011. At this time, I worked in the office of a regional command. I've been read into various truly bizarre government programs. However, thinking about it, I still don't know what to make of this kid. I don't know what to get out of writing this. Maybe someone knows more about this kid, or has had other similar experiences. It's certainly not extraordinary, like some of the other experiences people on here have had. I'm not saying this kid was magical or demonic. I can't rule out that he was truly just some kind of misfortune. Maybe the right thing to do would have been to get him help. However, I just can't get past how much I hated him for no reason. Between that and the smell, my experience wasn't that bizarre. What I do know is that I'm fine with never seeing that kid again. Maybe these black-eyed kid experiences can be explained by kids just being extra weird. I had something appear to me 6 years ago. It was invisible at first and would do things like cause a wind to blow through the room. It would appear in the darkness of the bedroom as a humanoid figure, as blacker than the darkness. It became the sensation of something crawling under the bed covers and over my crotch. It would pleasure me at times. I remember focusing on a succubus, but I thought they were supposed to look like something. What I have is completely invisible, except when I look at it out of the corner of my eye in a very low light. I can see a thin, transparent tendril, almost like smoke. It constantly attacks me at night, and has, over the last few years, began attacking during the day. I feel like muscle spasms crossed with a worm crawling up my leg. It can cause pain in the tips of my toes, almost like it is biting. I can grab hold of it temporarily, and literally feel it pulling as I wrap it around my fingers. If I hold it above a flame, it spasms like mad. When I wake in the morning, it has usually wrapped itself all across my back. When I didn't burn it regularly, it got stronger and stronger. I have heard it chink against things audibly when sometimes I throw it against something. I've never spoken to it, but I know that when it is active, I experience more paranormal activity. I've tried invoking the name of Jesus to get rid of it, but it will not go. I've also been able to put it on other people. I've freaked friends out by having it climb on them. It will usually affix around the crotch or, more commonly, the lower back. What the heck am I experiencing? It became very active when I tried astral projection whilst under the influence of alcohol. That was a mistake.
About 10 or so years ago, I had the house to myself as I was still living with my parents at the time, and I had a friend over. The night was going smoothly and normal. We're just playing co-op video games as teenage boys do, but eventually we both end up on our phones scrolling through Tumblr. My friend stumbles upon a 40 to 50 minute audio tape file of a private investigator talking to a high school campus about his experience during a murder investigation he's conducted. I believe it took place in Texas, but long story short, towards the end of this audio file, it leads up to the PI believing that the victim was exposed to a demon or evil entity that was the reason for the death of this person. He states it at the very end of the testimony of the case, that the demon feeds off your fear, and the more you think about it, the stronger its energy and presence gets. As far as we could both tell, it was a real testimony, and not a parody or creepypasta. So me and my friends hear the whole 40 or so minutes of testimony, We're just enthralled, almost hypnotized by it, and afterward try to go back to playing our game. Not 5 minutes later, the power in my room goes out. My room only. No big deal. I just go flip the breaker and turn it back on. 3 minutes later, boom, again. Flip the breaker again. A minute later, the same, and this continues with shorter time frames until the power in my room simply won't come back on. The first time it happens, we think it's a mere coincidence, but by this point, fear is really happening, and the thought of the entity is in our heads. At this point, it's around midnight to 1 a.m. My friend decides this isn't worth it for him, and he heads back to his place. Lol, thanks, leaving me by myself. The night goes on a little bit, and after my friend left, I spent the rest of the night in my living room with the lights on and crashed on the couch. I wake up with the TV still on, between 3 to 4 a.m. I don't know what possessed me to return to my room for sleep, but for some reason I convinced myself it was all in my head. I fall asleep incredibly fast, and my dream begins with me in my bed and room, just as I was laid out in real life in the pitch darkness. This was extremely vivid, and an exact replica of my room. It was as lucid as could be, almost like being awake, but at one of the top corners of my room, where the wall meets the ceiling, I saw a pair of angry, dirty yellow eyes that were on a body blacker than black, hanging on my ceiling, just staring into my soul. I was fixated on the eyes, and they were fixated on me. I was just in shock and couldn't move, but the second I tried to move at all, the shadow figure zoomed to another corner of my ceiling and then launched at me. I woke up in a sweat just before I get contacted. The dream felt so real and vivid I woke up literally screaming, and there was a real sense of dread that took over my entire body in that moment and felt physically and mentally sick. Power's still not working in the room, so I went to the living room once again and finished the night with all the lights on, not sleeping well at all. Nothing more ever came from that night, but as far as I can tell and find, the audio tape never existed. I've spent days upon days trying to find it multiple times all over the internet, and nothing even comes close up on the search results. By the way, the power to my room worked perfectly the following day after the sun rose, and has ever since. I swear, I don't know what happened. I've tried so many times to explain it rationally and to find the audio tape we'd listened to that night, and I haven't come close, neither has my friend, and we both remember it like it were yesterday.
This is actually a part 2 to a banishment I did for a family. About 8 months later, I get home from work just about after midnight one night, and there was a desperate message on my machine for me to call them back. I wasn't going to call anyone that late, so I go in and fix my bedtime half pot of coffee. I've always been weird. Drinking a half pot of coffee will put me to sleep faster than anything. So about the time my coffee gets done and I pour a cup, the phone rings. I pick it up and it's Jason, the man that left the desperate message earlier. He said the church down the road is sponsoring an exorcism on a young girl, and they are not having any luck. Is there any way I can come down? Now, it was over a 45-minute drive to his house, then on over to the church. It's already going on 1 a.m. I said yes, I would be there ASAP. About 25 minutes later, I pull up at his house. I won't say how fast I was going. He jumps in the van and gets me down to the church. I pull up to a back side door. Right as I park and cut off the engine, 4 men come running out the door. Don't forget, I'm still in my pizza uniform, covered in cornmeal and dough, and other toppings along with pizza sauce. I sit there and say my prayers, wait for my answer from God. Then I get out, walk up to the 4 men. It seems they ran out when the girl in the chair that she was tied to started levitating. She was chanting something that just put the fear into them. 2 of the men were exorcists. The other 2 men were her family. So after listening to them cry, I said, "Gentlemen, do you want to see how it's done?" They said, "How what's done?" I said, "Banishing the demon, and there is one, I can feel it from here." They tried to stop me. They were professionals, and it was dangerous in there. I said, "Come on," and waved them in as I walked in. I walked up to a 13-year-old girl. I looked back and forth between her and the men, then said, "Cut her loose." The four tried to argue. My guys started loosening the straps. They were like, "Are you crazy?" I said, "I command you in the name of Jesus Christ, do not move." There was a horrible growl from the girl's body. After she was loose, I asked how and why the demon had chosen her. It took a minute, and finally, the girl's body said,
"She was stupid enough to use a Ouija board, and just invited me in."
I said, "Okay, it's time for you to go home." She started growling and tried to lunge at me, but could not get out of the seat. Me and my friend had to just kind of push the fall back out of the way so I could do my thing. I walked up to her, put my left hand on her shoulder, took my right hand, lifted her chin, to a soft growl from her. I looked into her eyes and said, "I'm just the messenger. I have no power over you. But I'm not the one commanding you. Jesus Christ commands you to leave this girl, return to hell and never return." She looked back into my eyes, tilted her head to the side. Then you saw peace come over her face, and the voice of a 13-year-old girl asked, "Who are you?" Those two exorcists were mad. They'd been trying for 3 days with no luck. I come in and actually accomplish the goal in 30 seconds. In a total of 10 minutes, I found out all kinds of information. The two family members were really happy. I didn't mention everything that I discussed, and it wasn't quite as easy as I mentioned. I think I had to tell it twice, maybe 3 times to leave. But it should be that easy. If you believe and have faith, and you not only have God's permission, but He called you to do this, then nothing can stand against you. They had something missing. I don't know what they were missing. That was and is not my business. The only thing or person I need to worry about is me and my relationship with God. I think I'm closer to Him now than I was back then.
In 2002, when I was 19, I believe I had a close and personal encounter with a dark entity. My family lived in West Virginia, and up the hollow like most people in the state. Late one night, myself and 3 others decided to take a walk a bit further up the hollow, in a long, large loop. The idea was to walk along the roads which circle around the back of the family property. A short trip through the woods behind my great-uncle's house and then down the driveway to my house. In order to reach his property line, we had to leave the old dirt road and cross through a cow field. I was in the lead because I typically walk through these fields/woods when hunting and would walk this route in the dark with no problems. I felt that a bit of a backstory on my uncle is necessary. He was a Korean War infantryman. He was long divorced, bitter, and an alcoholic who didn't even socialize with his children or grandchildren. The man could literally drink a 30-pack of Milwaukee Best each and every day. There were times he would clear 2 30-packs. I know because I collected his cans every day for money. He was a bitter and hateful old man. It must be said that I regularly walked these woods, and before the night in question I had never experienced anything at all, or after, mainly because I never walked the route in the dark ever again. I would take the long walk home to avoid that patch of forest. It was a cloudy, moonless night, and as you guessed it, dark. No, we did not have flashlights. When I approached the fence, nothing. However, when I grabbed the barbed wire to cross, there was an entity, waiting on the other side. I did not see it. I saw darkness at first. It made itself known through a growl, guttural and low. It was head level to me, about 5'9". When it started to growl, it sounded between a bear and a deep rumble of a large dog. It was directly in front of me and I froze. My senses were going crazy trying to figure out what I was standing in front of. Its breath was hot and smelled of rotting flesh. Whatever it was in my face, daring me to cross. I must say, too, with my eyes only, because I dared not move. I tried to find it. I saw the tree directly behind it, but not it. I knew that I was going to die, and at that moment I was terrified to the core. As abrupt as it made itself known, it was gone. It left without making a sound. I felt all the hairs stand on end, and my heart honestly must have missed a beat. I felt the chill of the air. I felt like I could breathe again. So I turned to look at those that were with me, and my worst fear was realized. This was real. It actually happened. 2 of them were frozen in spot with horror-stricken faces, and the third was already running. Without another thought, I let go of the fence and ran past the 2. I ran to the closest dusk to dawnlight, climbed up an apple tree next to it, and waited there until daylight. I did go back the next day with a rifle on my body to find nothing. No hair, no footprints, nothing. You could see where I was standing. I never figured out what it was for sure. That was until last year, when I discovered the accounts of Ed and Lorraine Warren. They explained the many different haunts of demons, how they operate, and that it's when it all clicked. I came face to face with a demon. I figured I should let you know that my uncle did survive the oppression. His youngest son had removed him from the house and put him in rehab. My uncle never talked to his son again. He lived another 15 years, got clean, saved, remarried, and passed away from natural causes. To my knowledge, once he was out of the house, he never went back and never collected his possessions from the house. To be honest, it was a shanty at best. Years after the incident, only one of the family ever lived in the house, and they only lasted a few weeks. According to my cousin, they packed up everything and moved out, and called and said they wouldn't be returning. Before you ask, the house fell in on itself a few years ago. This is my true account of the situation, and I never truly found out what it was. All I know is Ed and Lorraine Warren spelled out how demons work. I'm a Christian, and as such, I believe in physical demons. All I know is that Ed and Lorraine Warren spelled out how demons work, and I'm fairly confident that is what I encountered.
I am a female, and was 23 at the time of this story. These events took place in 2010, and I finally thought it was time to share the story of the horrifying events I went through with the demon in the basement. At the time, I had been on the lookout for a new place to live, as my roommate had a cat and I could no longer deal with my allergies. When I moved in with her, I was living in a dingy motel room, so having a roommate in a proper house was a serious upgrade. I thought the cat wouldn't be too much of an issue, but it was not meant to be. Being an animal lover, I could never even think about suggesting to someone to get rid of a beloved pet, so I opted to move out instead. I had been searching for a new place for a couple of weeks when I came across an ad on Craigslist describing a room for rent on a waterfront property. It was surprisingly affordable, and I was very intrigued. There were no photos on the ad, but the address was pretty close by. So I took a drive over to the place to take a look, and the property was beautiful. It definitely looked lived in and well maintained. So I called the number on the ad later that afternoon to make an inquiry. This is when I first came across Crazy Patty. At first, she seemed extremely friendly on the phone. We laughed and joked and got along very well. She said she would be delighted to meet me and come around at any time to view the property and the room for rent. So I made an appointment for the next day. I pulled up in the driveway and was greeted by Patty, waving warmly at me from the front porch. She was a middle-aged woman in her 40s. She had a kind of hippie-ish clothing style. She wore thick glasses and had long, frizzy brown hair. She was shorter than me by a couple of inches, and she spoke in a kind of nasally, baby voice. Now, before I continue, I would like to give a little background on the women of my family. We are all gifted in the spiritual realm. The gift can be traced back to my great-great-grandmother, who could read tea leaves. She was extremely gifted, and did readings for her entire life, until one day when she finished her tea and read her son's death. Needless to say, she never read tea leaves again. Since then, the women on my mother's side have inherited some kind of special gift. Whether it is clairvoyance, clairsentience, or something of that nature. Funnily enough, no one since my great-great-grandmother has had the ability to read tea leaves. I was lucky or unlucky enough to be a clairvoyant, meaning I can see, hear, and even smell things from the spirit world. These things happen very rarely to me, and at this point I just considered my abilities a bit of an annoying quirk and had not yet accepted them as part of who I am. Even though I was aware of my gifts and the spirit world, I was still a very skeptical person and always tried and even wanted to find rational explanations for things before I came to any conclusions about any kind of spiritual activity. Before these events, I had never experienced any kind of malevolent or demonic being. Since my phone conversation with Patty had gone so well, I was expecting us to get along just as well in real life. As I walked up the stairs of the porch to shake her hand, I immediately noticed her eyes. I can't fully explain how they looked, only that they were off. She said how nice it was to meet me and shook my hand. I immediately got icy chills down my spine. I managed to smile and said that it was great to meet her too. She took me inside and, to be fair, the house was beautiful. It had a massive living room with huge skylights, and there were lush plants everywhere. The kitchen was ultra-modern and sparkling clean. There was also a huge 2-story deck out back fully kitted out with furniture, a bar, and a fire pit. The deck opened out to a private beach on the lake. I immediately fell in love with the place. Patty took me downstairs to the finished basement, where the room for rent was. The basement consisted of 4 rooms, a large living room with a pool table, a bathroom, a smaller living room, and a bedroom. The rooms for rent were the bedroom and the smaller living room. Apart from being a little dark and without a huge amount of light, the rooms for rent were lovely. They were clean and fully furnished. Patty was extremely nice to me, and she seemed very excited to show me around, but something still seemed off about her. Despite the uneasiness I felt, I decided that I loved the house and that the next day we went through all the relevant paperwork. I paid my deposit and before you know it, I was all moved in. At the time, I had no family where I was living. One side of my family were in Europe, where I had just moved from at the beginning of the summer, or all the way down in the southern part of the US. So I was feeling a little lonely, but I was optimistic. Patty worked during the day, and I worked at night at a bar, so we rarely saw each other. At first, this arrangement was perfect, and I was setting in nicely. I had no issues until one night. About a week in, I decided to cook myself dinner. I had a night off, my first since moving in with Patty, and I was dying to use the gorgeous kitchen. Growing up, I was always taught to clean as I go, so I did just that. I heard Patty's keys in the front door and greeted her as she walked into the kitchen. My smile faltered as I saw the expression on her face. She looked enraged and she yelled at me, "What the hell are you doing?" Her brow was furrowed and her lips were pulled back in a snarl. I was completely shocked and my body froze for a moment before I answered shakily that I was just cooking dinner. I tried to appease her by offering her some, but she swelled like an angry toad and screamed that I had destroyed her kitchen. Now, my dinner was fairly simple, and I had been cleaning as I went along. The only thing that was dirty was one pan, which was already soaking in soapy water. I explained that I obviously had every intention of cleaning it up, but she screeched again, stomped down the hall and slammed her bedroom door. I quickly cleaned up everything and made sure the place was spotless before taking my plate down to my bedroom and eating down there, so I didn't run into her again. After that, things just got worse. Patty was no longer friendly with me and looked at me like I was just a gross insect that she longed to squash. I tried desperately to look for somewhere else to live, but I lived in a tourist area, and it was a seasonal town. It was coming into winter and many businesses had shut down and residents moved out of state. I could find nowhere else to rent that I could afford. I even contacted my old roommate, but because of a sudden family issue, she moved back in with her parents. I kept looking for weeks, but found nothing. As the weeks went by, it became apparent that Patty didn't want me there. She wanted no trace of a roommate in her house. She wanted to collect the money, and that was that. I tried to stay out of her way by doing my household chores and emerging from the basement when she was out of the house. On my nights off, I went into work to eat dinner, so I didn't have to use the kitchen. I made sure to only buy microwave dinners for the nights I couldn't afford to eat out. Every time I had to come upstairs and Patty was there, I would be met with her intense glare, with those eyes that continued to be off somehow. At this point in time, my living situation had started to affect me physically. I was constantly exhausted, my skin was paler, and I became very skittish. It was after this change in me started to take hold that things in the basement started happening. Things would go missing and then turn up. At first, I just put this down to forgetfulness, which I am prone to. But one day, something happened that made me incredibly uneasy. See, I always kept my work shoes in a specific spot when I came downstairs. I had been called in for a day shift last minute and was getting my uniform on. On my way out, I went to grab my shoes, but they weren't there. Now, this was something I was not forgetful about. I always kept my shoes in a specific spot because Patty didn't want me dirtying up the carpet. I went upstairs to check and see if I had left them up there, and I hadn't. I looked everywhere for them and couldn't find them anywhere. Not putting it past Patty to do something mean like take my shoes, I went back downstairs to grab a different pair, only to stop dead in my tracks. Right there in their normal spot were my shoes. My heart leapt out of my chest. What was going on? I knew I was forgetful at times, but they definitely weren't there a minute ago. There had to be an explanation. Patty was at work, so I knew it wasn't her. And it was at that moment that a thought crept into my mind. Was there someone else in the house? Terrified, I grabbed my shoes and ran upstairs. I grabbed my keys and immediately left the house, locking the door behind me. I wondered if I should call the police, but what would I tell them? That I found my work shoes right where I'd left them? I thought about telling Patty, but the thought of telling her that something had bothered me like that would only give her ammunition to torment me further. So, I didn't tell anyone. After work, I came home to Patty eating her dinner, and a mess in the kitchen. Luckily, I had the foresight to grab some food to go from the bar, so I crept in as quietly as possible and just went downstairs to eat, as I always did. I turned on the light in my room and for a split second thought I had seen a dark figure in the far corner of the room. I did a double take, my heart pounding. I had to be going nuts. The stress of this place was starting to make me hallucinate. Satisfied, but still a little uneasy with my explanation, I turned on my TV and began to eat my dinner. As I ate, I was still convinced I saw flutters of movement coming from the corner of the room, just out of my sight. But every time I looked, nothing. This mysterious figure would start making regular appearances out of the corner of my eye, but again, when I tried looking, there would be nothing there. I thought I was losing my mind, and I became even more withdrawn. It was after a few months of this happening that the dreams started. I would be having a perfectly normal dream, and then all of a sudden, I would have the feeling of being strangled by a faceless man. I would be fighting him off, and I would always wake myself up by screaming. I would wake up sweating and my heart would be pounding. The worst part was my throat would be sore, and I never knew if I had really been screaming or not. I would like to think that if I was, Patty would run down, but that was unlikely. I would start out having these dreams once or twice a month. Then, as it came closer into the fall of the following year, they started happening more regularly. Once a week, twice a week, every other day. I was feeling completely broken down mentally, emotionally, and physically. I was a shell of my former self. At this point, you are probably wondering why I stayed at Crazy Patty's house for as long as I did. Well, for those of you who have never experienced emotional and mental abuse, consider yourself lucky. It is extremely powerful. Patty used a variety of techniques, including manipulation, intimidation, and gaslighting, to ensure I stayed where I was. She hated me there, but she wanted the money. She literally had me convinced that I wouldn't find anywhere else as nice as her place for the price I was paying, and that no one would put up with me anyway. Up until this point, I had not considered my unsettling experiences at Patty's house to be demonic. I had put them down to a side effect of being so stressed and beaten down. Until one night, as usual, I had eaten my dinner out of a to-go box in my bedroom. I was sitting on my bed with my laptop on my lap. I had been watching some funny videos online when, all of a sudden, I couldn't take a breath. I felt like my chest was being constricted by an invisible vice grip. I went to move my hands up to my throat to check for a swelling or something, but I couldn't move my arms. I was completely paralyzed. It was then that I finally saw the figure in the corner. Its face was covered with a hood, but it lifted its head just enough for me to catch a glimpse of its face. Its eyes were huge and bulbous, much like the milky, pupilless eyes of an anglerfish. It had no other features except for those eyes, and that smile, that toothy smile, full of uneven and rotten teeth. A smile that extended beyond the boundaries of its face. Think of Fred from that seriously creepy episode of Courage the Cowardly Dog. My heart stopped, and as soon as I saw this figure full on, it disappeared. I finally understood what was happening. I was being attacked. Somehow, I fought the pressure, and it subsided. This ordeal couldn't have lasted for longer than 10 seconds or so, but it felt like much longer. I was finally able to draw a breath and lay on my bed, panting, as if I had just been drowning. I immediately jumped up and dug into my junk drawer. I found a few white candles, some sage, and a few crystals. I lit the white candles for protection. I lit the sage to purify the room, and I kept my crystals in my hand. Needless to say, I did not sleep much that night. After this incident, I continued to keep lighting sage at all times when I was in the room awake. And things settled down for a while. It wasn't until Halloween night that the crescendo of my experience peaked. Cliché, I know, but think about it. It was, and still is, believed that the veil to the spirit world is at its thinnest on All Hallows Eve, making it easier for spirits to enter our world. I'd been working that night and had gotten home around 1 a.m. Exhausted, I fell right to sleep, only to get that strangling sensation some hours later. But this time, it felt different. This time, it felt more real. In my dream, the entity that was attacking me had grabbed me by the throat. In the past, I had not seen its face while it was doing this. I finally got a full-on view of its face. I could see the cracks on its rotten teeth. I could see the pale blood vessels on its grotesque eyes. And I could smell its rotten breath. I felt a scream coming, but I couldn't get it out. In my dream, I fought and fought, desperately trying to escape its grasp. It picked me up by my throat and slammed me into the wall behind me. I kept fighting it with all my might until I finally woke up. I was sweating and panting, and tears were streaming down my face. I looked at the clock. It was only 3 a.m. But as soon as I looked at my clock, my blood froze in my veins. Not because it was 3 a.m., the traditional witching hour, but it was then that I realized that I was not laying in my bed. I was sitting up against the wall. I leapt out of bed and ran to the bathroom, afraid I was going to be sick. Luckily, my stomach held, and I ended up splashing some cold water on my face. It was only when I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror that I had to stifle a scream. My neck was bruised and scratched, like I had been strangled. Without even thinking about how late it was, I called my boss in absolute hysterics. The bar I worked at was attached to a hotel, and I pleaded with him to let me sleep in one of the rooms that night. He did, and I decided right then and there that I would be moving out of Crazy Patty's house. I arrived back the next day to pack up what few belongings I had. After I had everything all packed up, I noticed her bedroom door was open. This was highly unusual, as she always kept it locked when she wasn't there. Thinking maybe her car was in the shop and she was in there, I went over to tell her that I was leaving. But she wasn't in there. I went to close the door when something on the floor caught my eye. Normally, it is out of character for me to snoop in someone else's room, but something in my gut just told me to check out what it was that caught my eye. On the floor was a planchette that had been broken in half, with the glass shattered all over the floor. The glint of the glass is what caught my eye. And on the other side of the room was the board, the Ouija board. It finally clicked that it had been Patty that set this entity on me. I stormed out. I was fiddling with the house key, trying to get it off my keychain to leave on the counter with a note I had left her, when I noticed movement on the deck outside. I looked up and was absolutely horrified to see Patty standing on the other side of the glass door, staring right at me, completely naked. She had her hands on the glass and seemed to be pressing her face right against the glass. It was then that I noticed her eyes. Her eyes had always been off to me, but finally I understood why. Instead of her usual, slightly off eyes, staring right back at me were the milky, bulbous eyes of the entity. I quickly turned around, ran to my car and tore out of the driveway and never returned. Things got better after that. My anxiety subsided, my face filled out again, and I started to be a lot more social. After a few weeks, I moved into an apartment with two girls I worked with and got along very well with. I never saw Crazy Patty again. As of telling this story, almost 12 years have passed, and I am no longer easily beaten down by manipulation tactics. I have become a lot more assertive and will not tolerate any attempt to deceive or manipulate me. I've also been practicing white magic in the form of plants and cooking, and have embraced my clairvoyance as part of who I am. I'm happy to say that I've never experienced anything like I did at Crazy Patty's house. If I get even a whiff of negative energy, I get the hell out of Dodge. All in all, I'm a much healthier, stronger and happier person than I was all those years ago. But late at night, I still get the horrifying image of Patty staring into my soul, with the dead eyes of the demon in the basement.